Okay, this one's inadvisable. Manic Street Preachers. You can't put the Manic's albums in order of quality. They're too different. Just watch me. I don't know where I'm going with this.
Rank the albums.
The first release that's technically bigger than a single is the new Art Riot EP. I think this is a reasonable demonstration of the sound of the Manics, but not of the songs. They had better material at the time, really, pre-album stuff, but we've got this, and it's inessential. At the time of this release, the Manics were kind of just imitating The Clash and Birdland. It wasn't until they threw in some more imitations that they became original in their own right. Then their 18-track debut album. Well, that's obviously a much fuller, maybe too full, definitely too full suite of what the Manics have to offer. This is one of those double albums where I'd probably give it a higher rating if you removed some of the tracks. Which is kind of callow of me, you know, I could always just skip them or listen on a modern medium. There is beautiful stuff on here, there is storming stuff on here. It's full of vitality and it is vital, but it's got some massive flaws. One being the overcrowded track list, and the other being the cheap sound, specifically the drum machine. It's that terrible habit that was big in the 80s with this 1992 of choosing to use a drum machine when you have a drummer at hand and choosing to make it sound worse. Sean was left programming the drum machine to replace all sounds of himself on the album. It's a terrible decision. I understand some of the remasters, of which I should probably get a copy, replace the drums in some songs. The tracks can still shine through that sound. James is already amazing at guitar. The anything goes kind of track list allows for some fun along the way. The kind of power ballads particularly still stand up. I'm referring to Motorcycle Emptiness and Little Baby Nothing. One by one, there's a lot of great stuff on here. Overall, the sound is quashed by some terrible decisions. That said, it's still something you need to hear. The Manics at this point are everything I want in music, really. Their songs aren't weighed down by the cliches of, like, gender and love. I admire how overtly political they are, and they take the best of rock and roll without at all feeling seedy. The Manics have often denounced their follow-up, and I don't see why. This easily has some of their best singles, and a few more that should have been singles. I also don't really get the epithet soft rock. I'd call it hard rock with something to say. I really admire Richie's lyrics for how he is sensitive to all of the kinds of suffering, and just wants to illustrate them. I think that's very important to do, and I think that's done here on a brilliant little album. It's only 10 tracks long. It's from an age of miserable rock music, and it's a really good example of miserable rock music. It's a more cogent product than the debut album. It's going atop. This one's gonna stay pretty high in the pile throughout this video, and that's not a mistake. You're a mistake if you don't like it. I think the Manic's career intends to avert any kind of ranking, because I'm going to put these discs in one order, but it really oversimplifies them to condense all this down to one dimension. Obviously, magnum opus, the Holy Bible. What can I say about this? Nothing new, it's just a work of ugly beauty. It illustrates the depths of despondency, but with some lovely spiky guitar music. Do we still say that? Spiky? This is the Manic's third album and their third essential album and their most essential album. I doubt anyone watching is not familiar with this, or at least familiar with the idea that this is the one that you need to hear. This is the one that you need to hear, as well as the other ones you need to hear. Up it goes! Tragedy befell the Manics before their next release. Richie disappeared and has not been seen since. The band chose to continue and entered their blue period with Everything Must Go. The Manics once again reinvented their sound with a kind of jubilant rock music, quite radio-friendly, and it's a good choice and a great result. Some of Richie's writings are still used on this, but Nicky Wire largely took over as lyricist. It's funny how this sounds quite vast, but when you actually listen close, there's not that many layers to the music. This is a three-piece band with not that much adornment on top of it. It's a testament to the talent of the musicians involved, and it proves that they can survive such a loss. It's the first time they've not been better than their last work, but that was impossible. It's going here. Everything Must Go brought a new mainstream success to the Manics, and they continued to ride that tsunami with the next album. There's definitely old school Manics fans who've been alienated along the way to this, but they'll always be that throughout their career. In fact, maybe it's now me. If they chose to miss out on this, then they're missing out on some both widescreen and intimate rock music, with both massive singles and massive could-only-be album tracks.
It drags a bit, could do with a couple more highlights.
Fuck the reissue that replaced the track Nobody Loved You. Yeah, it's their least essential album yet, but that's no insult at all. For longer ones like this, I'm probably gonna film all of the ranking bits separately to me talking. Then, after the mainstream success, comes the aloof left turn. Know Your Enemy was criticised at the time, and I don't really get why. It's just they're choosing to be indie. This is one of those that comes after a mainstream hit and kind of tries everything except having a mainstream hit.
It's a good little smorgasbord.
Yeah, it's less welcoming than the last couple of releases, but it's got a lot of punk spirit. And I find that welcoming enough. I don't have any of their hits compilations on CD, but the Lucy tracks on them are probably worth it. One compilation I do have is this one that's full of B-sides, and still a really good listen. Not quite a top-tier B-sides band, but a high-tier B-sides band. One disc of this is all covers, and you don't really need to hear, but I'd advocate their original B-sides in general. So there. Then it's 2004 and it's time for a post-Coldplay album. I mean, like they didn't already influence Coldplay enough with This Is My Truth. I say that, but public opinion and Manic's opinion is needlessly harsh on Lifeblood. It's still a really good listen in this less showy way, and it's the Manics once again trying out a new sound but never forgetting what they're good at.
If the adjective mature is a red flag to you, skip this one, but you probably already tuned out when the punk anthems ended and you're just drawing dicks by now. See you in 2009. It's easy to forget the God Save the Manic EP, even whilst listening to it. Yeah, I've not got that.
This brings us to solo albums time. James provided a surprisingly peppy and cute set of pop songs. I think the tone of this means I don't listen to it often, but then when I do, I think, why don't I listen to this more? Yeah, my format's falling apart. I don't know where to put this. There? Nicky provided this bitey little set of post-punk compositions. He's frequently criticised for his voice and whatever. Nicky's emerging compositional talents will be one of the main features of the later-day Manics, but this set itself isn't that important. It's still good. I've not yet heard Sean's solo album, but it sounds promising. Then, at the time, this felt like the Manics refinding their fire, but I think this one hasn't aged that well, and though if I consider the tracks one by one, there's a lot to love there. The new habit of only writing one verse and then just replicating that for the second verse is pretty bad. It's just not an essential listen. There's a cheesiness to it that makes it quite disposable, but they still make good of it, just not as good as the rest. It was then, after reproving themselves as a three-piece, that the Manics allowed themselves to peruse Ritchie's leftover writings and compose an album that's often seen as a follow-up to the Holy Bible. It's not synonymous with that, there is a separate avenue of sound on here.
It's more urgent punk, with each song a rush, except for the Heartbreakers.
There's Steve Albini, there's Ritchie's lyrics, and that's what Ritchie's lyrics bring out of the Manics as a band. It's kind of amazing that they can still put this kind of stuff out in 2009, but more in a sense that makes you wonder why they bother doing anything else. It looks like this is their second best product. Then Postcards, a needless shot at mass communication. There's good material on here, but there's also some of the Manic's worst ideas. I think this album is somewhat unfairly disparaged, but also unfairly praised. The amount of it that's ornate, maximal radio rock is really worth it, and yet just not as a full album, bit for misfire. It can go here. Then, after failing to mass communicate, the Manics went more experimental again and produced 2 albums at the same time, the first release of which was called Rewind the Film, and this has an acoustic orientation. And it's a reasonable enough little listen, but with some stuff to skip, kind of unspectacular. I'm sorry. But that was intended. They correctly accessed unspectacular. It's alright. And then, get your downvotes ready, I'm not into futurology. The very first verse attacks fans having any criticism of the Manics. Hi. I think several ideas on this disc just sound scrappy and unfinished. I do love Dreaming a City and Between the Clock and the Bed, but generally I'm not sure what Nicky has to say anymore. Maybe the Manics needed this to innovate their sound a bit, but as a listener I didn't need it. This is the one I'm wrong about, but it's going down here. So as those last few, other than the journal, populated the very lower ends of this stack, I realised that I wasn't necessarily into contemporary Manics, and they don't owe me that. They've got an audience, it's just art, you know?
I guess if I still define as someone who'll keep up with the Manics, then maybe they do owe me that as their audience. But then I can just choose to stop being their audience and let them get on with it.
But then when the terribly named next album came out, suddenly this one is for me, Sucker Punch. I think they sound rejuvenated, I think this is a great record for 30 years in. I think we're already disregarding this one, but that's what we do in the Manics fandom. And in this dual case, I think that's a mistake. It's not top tier, but it's good. Thus far, we've got one more James Dean Bradfield solo album. It's a cozy little thing with some things to write home about.
But nothing to YouTube about. It's good.
That brings us up to date to the Ultra Vivid Lament. I guess from the title I was expecting some kind of ultra vivid lament. And instead, this is a huge misstep. It's like they've covered culture, alienation, and despair, and now they're on to... There is one promising track of this right at the start, an uncharacteristically long song with a nice way that it builds up its layers. Nothing else on here comes close or was worth releasing. I guess they're coasting. They say that this is meant to sound like ABBA, and it kind of does, but they're forgetting that ABBA are good at music. It sounds more like McCarthy, really. I thought up this series before this album was released, and I thought, how nice, I'll be able to end the Manics video on a positive note. And they went and fucked that up. Bottom of the pile, that's kind of worthless. I adore what the Manics brought to music, a political passion tied to compelling yet varied rock and roll. They would vary their image as well. They know what's important to communicate about, and they know how to communicate it. They are honestly devoted to making great music, and it pays off. In performance, James's lead guitar and vocals are mind-blowing, and the material beneath that often matches up to it. It's worth blowing minds with.
In melody, in poetry, melody and poetry not always perfectly matched. In power, talent, and ambition, they've long been extremely rewarding to keep up with. I thought that era was closing, it came back, it went again, and maybe that's a hit right now, but it's still worth my attention. The early stuff, though, you cannot deny. What an amazing band, providing some of history's best work. How is their influence not more felt? How is this level of literacy now retro? It feels like a complacency for the unchallenging, but to call the Manics challenging? No, it's immediately rewarding. There's just depth too. They are such an inspiration. Their works deserve to be known by everyone, but then the world would be better.
Ranking albums doesn't mean anything.